Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Earlier this week, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the IFS, predicted that the economic impact of leaving the EU could lead to 2 more years of austerity. Here's the latest downbeat assessment from economists of the prospects for the UK economy outside the EU. But should we take any notice of protagonists of what sometimes is known as the dismal science? Our Giles has been looking at their record.
I have, Andrew, and it's not brilliant. So, have our clairvoyant economists covered themselves in glory, or have their palms been crossed with silver for very little in return? In 1981, for example, 364 economists complained about Mrs. Thatcher's decision to raise taxes substantially at the height of a recession. The oracular economists, including future Bank of England Governor Mervyn King, said this so-called monetarist policy had no basis in economic theory. Turned out, however, their crystal ball was wrong, with the economy beginning to grow just days after the letter was published. In 1992, the economic establishment once again coalesced to back staying in the exchange rate mechanism. Remember that? They agreed with the Treasury line that leaving the ERM would put at risk the hard-won confidence in the economy. Black Wednesday came along, Britain was forced out, and the economy was soon picking up once again. They clearly didn't see that in their tarot cards. And many of the same wise men and women were soon calling for Britain to join the euro during the Blair era. 15 leading economists wrote to the FT in 2001 prophesying that joining the euro would safeguard Britain's prosperity in the EU. Whoops, it didn't, and they needed Gordon Brown to save their bacon, ruling out entry after it failed his 5 economic tests. Not so psychic after all. And now we come to the latest prediction, with 198 business leaders and economists writing a letter to the Times in February. They say leaving the EU would deter investment, threaten jobs, and put the economy at risk. Now here's the question. Will they be on the ball this time, the crystal ball, or will the mists of time once again fail to clear and leave us all fogged? Andrew.
Charles, thank you for that and for telling me that all these years getting my MA in economics was a complete waste of time. We're joined now by Professor Tony Yates. He organised a second letter to the Times, 2 always better than 1, earlier this month. It was signed by a different set of 200 economists, arguing that leaving the EU would be a major mistake. Why should we believe that, since you seemed, not you personally, but your profession, seems to have called almost every major economic event wrong?
Well, this isn't really about forecasting. I mean, there's a great analogy by Giles Wilkes, I think, in the FT, where he said, I could not forecast my own weight with any accuracy, 15 years hence. But if I stuff my face with pastries every morning, I guarantee you I'm going to get heavier. So there's a similar analogy. It's not really a matter of forecasting.
But everything we've had from the IMF, the OECD, the Treasury, the IFS, it's all forecasting.
Well, it's couched as a forecast, but really what you're comparing is 2 forecasts. All kinds of things unknown, but there's one thing that's different between the 2 scenarios, leaving the EU. And that's what we know something about. We could look at history and how trade and openness has affected economic performance, and we can get some sense of what did happen in the past, and therefore what would happen next time.
But if you look at the Treasury forecast, even though it was, and I mean the long-term one, the first one that came out, the 2030 forecast, even though it was disguised and it didn't actually put the figures, if you did the sums, what the Treasury forecast said was if we stay in the EU, we'll grow by a lot. If we leave the EU, we'll grow by a lot, but not as much. That's all it said. But that's not how it was dressed up.
I think the point they made is pretty reasonable. I think that's why.
But in both scenarios, we grow by a lot.
There's a fantastic force of innovation and entrepreneurialism will make itself felt in both cases. But in one case, you've got this restraint on trade, which is departing the single market, essentially.
But of course, what a lot of these reports have assumed is, and particularly the Treasury one, is that between now and 2030, we are incapable of doing any kind of free trade deals. Now, that's not an economist's call. That's a political call. That could be wrong.
To some extent, that's right.
You know, economists don't know any more than...
But I think it's the most reasonable view of how things...
What, that we could do no deals?
No, they're not saying we could do no deals.
But that's what the Treasury forecast is.
They're saying that likely economic life outside the EU involves erecting not just tariff barriers, which could be negotiated, but it would take a long time to do it, but also non-tariff barriers. It's the multiplicity of rules and standards that would emerge once we leave the single market that would be so damaging.
But, I mean, I guess people take notice of other people if they've got a track record of being right. Now, you were on the monetary strategy team of the Bank of England up till 2008. Did you see the financial crash coming?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Most economists thought we should join the European exchange rate mechanism. Would you agree that in the end that proved to be wrong?
Yes, but I dispute that most did.
Well, it was a pretty big consent. The Labour Party's economists wanted to, the Treasury economists wanted to, many independent at the time, at the same time, my own economic editor, who was an economist, wanted me to as well. That was the consensus, and it was wrong.
Let me put an analogy to you. So, in most hospitals, there are a lot of people dying. Every day, people die. But still, we entrust our health to doctors and surgeons and nurses and the entirety of medical science which has accumulated to this point. So, macroeconomics is hard.
It's also not a science like medical science.
Well, I don't want to get into philosophical semantics. There's a business to control a huge economy of 60 million people, and it's difficult. We haven't done it yet.
No, here's another. I mean, take the IMF. The IMF has been very much taking the Treasury line that our economy would be harmed if we left the European Union. We would grow more slowly, there would be a rise in inflation, and various other bad things would happen. This is the same IMF that told us on the very month that this economy was really starting to recover that the government was playing with fire on the economy, and that we carried on with these policies, we'd be heading for another recession. It was wrong.
Well, I think they had a point, actually. I mean,
but they were wrong.
This is an interesting example, because on this, our letter signatories differ quite wildly. I've had very heated debates with some of the other people on the list about whether the coalition were right or wrong. But I think that's still up for debate. If we'd had looser fiscal policy, once it became clear that we weren't going to categorise as like Greece, say, for example, we would have had a stronger recovery.
Well, but hold on. On the very month the IMF said we were about to go backwards and that we, Britain, were playing with fire, we began the strongest recovery of any G7 economy. You could say it could be stronger. Of course
exactly,
it could.
That's my point.
Of course. But that's not what the IMF said. The IMF didn't say on current policy, you'll recover, but not as strongly as you could. It said you're not going to recover.
No, they said on current policy, and given the way we see all the other shocks that's hitting the economy panning out, that's what will happen.
And
so,
it didn't.
News came along that nobody could have forecast.
What's that? What came along?
Well, whatever it was spurred the economy into life again.
Aren't you worried that economists, that even the work that you do is often misused? I mean, last night the Treasury put out this new analysis saying pensioners would be worse off by £137 a year if we leave the EU. The main reason it said that, when you dig down, is that it assumed that because the pound would fall, that inflation would be higher. What's clearly wrong with that forecast?
Well, I haven't read that in detail.
Okay, then I'll tell you.
Let me give you my own. Let me give you my own.
I'll tell you what's wrong, which is why this is a misuse. There is a triple lock on pensions, that they rise by whatever's higher, including inflation. So if the Treasury report was right, pensions would rise by the level of inflation. It's a misuse of economics, isn't it?
I don't want to comment on that, but a simple-minded analysis of what would happen to pensions is the fact that, on the assumption, and this is my view, and my letter signatories' view, that we are going to get poorer if we leave the EU. Pensions basically have to be financed out of the prosperity generated by those who are working.
But you see,
so that the size of the pie shrinks, and therefore the size of pensions will shrink, unless pensioners and new pensioners can wrestle a higher share of it.
None of the reports say that. None of the forecasts, the IMF, the OECD, the Treasury, the IFS, none say we'll get poorer. and language is important here. What they say is that we won't be as rich. Every forecast says we'll be richer, but if we leave the EU, we won't be as rich if we stayed in. That's not poorer.
I wouldn't say every forecast. I mean, there's a short-term cost of leaving too. So there's a
Well, tell
where
us
do we
a
end up in the end?
Tell us a forecast that, I mean, I've looked at the Centre for Economic Performance, the Oxford Economics, the CBI, the OECD, the IMF, the Treasury. Tell us one that says we'll actually be poorer as opposed to less rich than we would have been.
Well, let me give you my projection. So, there are two issues to deal with. Where do we end up in the long run? What happens in the short run? What happens in the short run is extremely dicey. So
It could be uncertain.
I think it's very likely to be negative.
Okay. What do you make of economists on these matters?
I'm fascinated. I'm right in saying, aren't I, that all these documents produced by the Treasury in the last few weeks, the Chancellor has excluded the Office for Budget Responsibility, which he brought, because he knew that he said before he came into off power that Treasury forecasting was a shambles, it was useless, and it was politicised, and there was abundant evidence that it was useless. And so he invented the Office of Budget Responsibility to bring independence and authority to forecasting, and that's been excluded from these last three disgraceful, dodgy dossiers. It's an economic shambles, isn't it?
Can I say that the Chancellor says there is some statutory reason why that's so? The OBR is only there to do budget forecasting. I don't know what the technical reason is.
I think he can't instruct it to do specific forecasts.
That's
I think
right.
that's the...
So in other words, we've returned...
Exactly. So the Treasury's had to go back to doing what it stopped doing 5 years ago.
What was attacked by the Chancellor as politicised and not to be trusted because it had been abused by Gordon Brown, and now it's being abused in exactly the same way by Chancellor Osborne as Brown and Darling abused their forecasts beforehand. And
can I just ask, we've got to move on, but just a question, Professor. Whether we leave the EU or stay in, how high do you put the risk now of a looming recession? Because that we return, because there's quite a lot of talk that the world economy is quite anemic, that some economies are slowing down, that there's been no great recovery, and that the business cycle is kind of, I know business cycles don't die, but on average we're kind of reaching the end of this one. How high would you rate that?
Maybe 30-40% chance of a recession. If we wake up and find that we're leaving.
But if we weren't,
the question was, regardless of Brexit, what's the chances of a recession?
Oh well, we can't say regardless of Brexit. I mean, Brexit's
but if we stay in,
if we stay in, unlikely. I think we'll have very subdued growth for another half year or so, partly because of the worries about Brexit that have accumulated over the last months, and partly because of other things weighing down on the world
economy.
economy.
No recession if we stay in, is your forecast. Professor, thank you.